We're trying to PSX has been on the forefront, playing an important role to foster awareness and understanding of the ESG principles within the overall financial landscape. Through our webinars, these roundtable sessions, and meetings with industrial representatives, with the workshops that we're holding, PSX is doing its trying to do its part to contribute in building the knowledgeable community around ESG practices. By doing this, we're trying to provide a platform for dialogue and knowledge exchange, and we're trying to facilitate a good understanding of ESG dimensions among market participants. This commitment to education aligns seamlessly with the webinar goals of accelerating the S in ESG that we have today. We will talk today on an important topic of accelerating the S, or the social aspect, in ESG, which is the social dimension. We're honored to have our distinguished speaker with us, Ms. Maha Qasim, who is the CEO of 0 Point Partners. With over 15 years of expertise in environment management, ESG strategy, and climate finance, Maha has been a trailblazer in championing sustainability. As we explore the social aspects of ESG, Maha will share insights into initiatives to collaborate with stakeholders, emphasizing the importance of collective efforts to drive positive change in championing the social dimension of ESG. Her extensive background in GHG emission accounting, GHG stands for greenhouse gases, corporate sustainability strategy, and ESG reporting positions her as an able leader to navigate the intricacies of the social dimension. Maha Qasim is a proud alumna of Yale School of Environment and Princeton University, bringing a wealth of knowledge to our discussion today. Join me in welcoming her as she talks about approaches in integrating social responsibility into the core of ESG practices. Ms. Maha, over to you. This is your platform now.
Thank you so much, Raida. A pleasure to be here, and thank you to all the participants who are joining online. I'm just going to share my screen so that you're able to view the presentation. Okay. All right. Okay. Can you see it, Raida?
Yes, we can see your screen now.
Okay. All right, so this is sort of, as Raida mentioned, a series of webinars on ESG. So last time we did a deep dive into the important strategy of ESG, strategy setting, and some of the new regulations that are being increasingly made. Sorry, I'm sorry, apologies. They're increasingly being made mandatory around regulation in Pakistan and internationally as well. So today we will deep dive into the social aspect of ESG. We'll cover what the social aspect of ESG really means, learn how to align the social element of ESG with business values and growth strategy, and finally learn about some of the stakeholder engagement best practices. So a quick recap from last time. ESG is essentially a risk management framework that helps organizations to categorize risk under the E, S, and G categories. So we've just included a few indicators that are commonly used under most ESG frameworks. So under environment, typically you would have, and increasingly the focus is on climate, including carbon emissions, physical asset resilience to, let's say, the natural disasters or impacts related to climate change. Then pollution includes air, water, soil pollution. There could be others as well. Resource use typically includes things like water stress, biodiversity and land use, energy. And under waste, you might have both solid and liquid waste, wastewater, electronic waste or e-waste, or even typical hazardous waste, depending on which industry we are talking about or interested in. The social pillar focuses on investing in people and relationships, and we'll talk more about this, as we go along. And then governance is all about building trust in society, And we have several regulators in Pakistan that are looking after the governance aspect, including the SECP, of course, and then the Pakistan Stock Exchange. And both of these platforms actually have been working with the ESG Task Force for Pakistan, which talks to the different industry representatives to see how governance of the ESG risks and frameworks can be made robust locally. So the social aspect or the dimension of ESG essentially focuses on creating enterprise value and enhancing public trust. And this is done by addressing, managing, and communicating social commitment. So the first aspect, of course, is addressing it. Second is managing it, and communicating essentially includes the disclosure of your social indicators and metrics. Broadly, there are, I would say, three broad stakeholder categories. First and foremost, I think most important for all industries is the customer, because the customers are the ones that purchase your products or your services. So they are central to your business model. Then, of course, you have your employees that work for your organization. And then the business model includes kind of larger employee categories, stakeholder categories, like, for example, investors. And then you have your regulators. There could be the government involved if it's a regulated industry. Then there are media, communities that operate or that live around your production facilities. It could be other competitors as well. So all of these would essentially be captured in the business model stakeholders. But different stakeholder categories for any business have different priorities or expectations from an organization. So what, let's say, the customer cares about might not be something that the employee necessarily cares about as much. Typically, for most industries, customers would care about product quality and safety, ethical selling practices, essentially that they're being, given what they're being marketed or sold, privacy and data security. And this applies specifically to industries that have access to a lot of information about their clients, let's say the financial institution industry, or even information technology firms, and increasingly the retail sector as well. Consumer responsiveness, and this is around addressing complaints. We've all, I think, spent some time, waiting for somebody to come and repair our product, or if you're trying to get help, let's say, the electricity is gone and you're trying to get the public utility to come and fix whatever the issue is at hand. So these are all examples of being able to respond quickly to customer issues or complaints. Employees, of course, value diversity and inclusion. And by this, what we mean in the context of Pakistan is having kind of a diverse workforce. Gender, of course, is one of the main themes for Pakistan, but this could include, of course, minority groups like especially abled people. So there are organizations like now PDP that are very active in promoting especially abled people to work in the corporate sector. You might have people from different religious backgrounds or different ethnicities. Globally, of course, this might take on different connotations depending on which country or which region you belong to, and there are different guidelines around this. Um, Wellness essentially refers to both physical safety as well as mental health and well-being, and this could be around providing a safe and secure environment for employees to work in. If it's an industry that that is hazardous or dangerous by nature, it's important that the employees are provided with appropriate safety measures and guidelines to keep them safe. Of course, depending, of course, on the industry that you belong to. Then hiring and advancement, and this is important because employees do expect that the organization will provide them with opportunities for growth, for advancement within the organization. This could include upskilling, training, exposure to different aspects of the business, and then the overall worker experience. And this talks about essentially employee engagement. So how engaged are your employees? Are they just quiet quitting, trying to do the bare minimum, or are they really putting in their best efforts to make your company or organization successful? And finally, the business model talks about the industry or the product or service itself, whatever you're offering. Here you might talk about product design. Products that are easy to access, supply chain management, let's say during periods of disruption like the COVID-19 pandemic. Globally, we experienced a lot of supply chain disruptions because, the flights were grounded, airports were grounded. So key in an increasingly globalized supply chain scenario, there are a lot of interdependencies. And if one, let's say, raw material supplier is not available or is offline, it can impact the entire production portfolio. And then accessibility, and this means making your product or service accessible to different segments of society, including, of course, different segments of your customers as well. And one common example that I like to talk about is, something as simple as making an ATM accessible to people in wheelchairs, because oftentimes there are some steps that you need to climb up, before you can actually withdraw money from the ATM machine. So this is a very simple example of accessibility within the social dimension of ESG. So as I mentioned earlier, all of these different stakeholders have different expectations. Investors, of course, for them, the bottom line is a high rate of return on their initial investment, but they also support sustainable value creation and risk mitigation. So they want to make sure that their capital, whatever is invested in the company, is safe for, let's say, the long term as well, the next 5 years or 10 years. So let's say, you were in an industry that is increasingly being like it's facing a lot of stigma because of the business they're in. Let's say it's a fossil fuel industry. So you want to ensure that whatever risks that you foresee in the future, these are adequately captured and communicated to your investors. So they need to be aware that, coal might be phased out in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years, and this would be the cost of investing in it at this point in time. The regulators, of course, expect the organization to comply with social laws and regulations and also to disclose material risk. So in Pakistan, these are some of the common regulators for some industries, and depending on whichever industry you belong to, there might be others as well. The SECP, of course, is the overarching kind of regulator at the federal level, especially for the corporate sector and for the listed companies. And they've released several corporate guidelines. There's the Code of Corporate Governance, and then they have more recently, actually, just last month, they have published a draft guideline on ESG, which I encourage all of you to look at. And it talks about specific metrics, both for the environmental as well as social and governance pillars. And essentially, it's encouraging companies. So it's voluntary right now. It's not mandatory, but they're encouraging companies to respond with any questions or comments. There's a draft period when, stakeholders can respond or can comment on the drafts. And then, of course, eventually it will be formulated into some kind of a policy later in time. The State Bank of Pakistan has also been regulating the banking sector for a long time, but increasingly because of the international compliance regulations and requirements, we are trying to indigenize some of these international laws to encourage local companies as well to become compliant and to remain at par with what's going on internationally as well. Employees, of course, at the bare minimum, expect a safe and secure environment, equal pay, and by equal I mean if two employees are working at the same level in an industry with similar qualifications, background, and experience, then ideally they should be receiving equal pay. There shouldn't be discrimination on the basis of gender or any other, quality. And then, of course, opportunities for growth and advancement. So that's very important for employees to progress and to remain engaged within the company. The customers, and they are, of course, your very important stakeholder, they expect that a company will produce quality goods and services responsibly and reliably, right? So responsibly and reliably, you can interpret it, of course, in different ways. But for certain sectors, this means, minimum outages, definitely at certain rates that are affordable, and especially for essential services, let's say healthcare or education, energy, utilities, infrastructure. So all of these are essentially non-compromisable in terms of quality and safety. So customers expect that these services will be provided in a reliable manner because it's not something they can provide for themselves. So generally, these industries are heavily regulated, but the customers, of course, do have a voice. And when these services are not provided responsibly and reliably, the customers will protest and they will sort of raise their voices against the organization of business. So this is just a summary slide talking about the different stakeholder expectations from the company. And as I mentioned, there are others as well that might not be directly linked here. But, definitely, I think the communities in which you operate, those are also a very important stakeholder. And that forms more into sort of the gambit of corporate philanthropies, just making sure that whatever business or product you're in is also being supplied to your communities where you operate, and that their needs are also taken care of, and that they are also benefiting from the presence of your organization. They shouldn't be worse off than they were before at the bare minimum. So really, why should businesses care, right? The purpose of ESG really is to be aligned with your corporate strategy, and to create value for your investors at the end of the day. So we need to put a financial commitment on ESG, because you need to be able to measure progress year on year, and it needs to align with your overall business practices. So essentially, what we've seen, what research has proven, is that ESG, because it's a risk management framework, it does have positive impact on business fundamentals for long-term success. And the reason why it's suddenly gaining a lot of momentum, globally, even we're having COP28, starting 30th November in Dubai this year. And this is because the new generation, especially the millennials and the Generation Z, they are increasingly asking for more transparency, for more commitments from businesses and from the private sector to be more responsible about their business practices. They are the generation that's most impacted by, let's say, climate change. Recently, we've seen movements globally like hashtag #MeToo movement, and this was around gender discrimination in the workplace. In the US and certain Western countries, there was the Black Lives Matter movement, which led to the way changes in the way businesses function. And even right now, we're seeing several um, trickle down effects from the Israel-Palestine war as well, just on the way companies do business. And we'll talk about that a little bit later down the line. But essentially, there's a very direct connection between stakeholder welfare and corporate profitability, because the company really needs to work with its internal as well as internal stakeholders to be able to support crisis response as well as business continuity planning. So, of course, there are a million external factors that impact, business continuity. But if you have a good relationship with your stakeholders, with your suppliers, with your customers, with your investors, with your employees, of course, most importantly, then generally you are able to weather these risks in a much more smooth manner than, let's say, a company that doesn't take ESG as seriously. So the social aspects of ESG are linked to value creation in multiple different ways, and this is from a McKinsey study. So first, of course, is top line growth. And in the social context, I wanted to highlight customer acquisition. This essentially means always looking for new opportunities to acquire new customers. We will talk about the examples later. So that's one way where your business or your ESG strategy directly links to top line growth, affects your business bottom line. The second opportunity is, of course, cost reductions. So if there are, let's say, a lot of protests, your employees are walking out because there's been a safety incident and someone has unfortunately passed away within the organization, this can result in a lot of operational disruptions, worker protests, a lot of negative media attention. The communities might be unhappy with the way this organization operates if you have a poor safety record. So all of these can result in costs for the company, things like litigation cost, cleanup cost, dealing with the media, dealing with the lawyers. So all of these costs build up. So if you have a good ESG strategy in place, and if you have already a good stakeholder relationship management plan, directly this will impact your bottom line as well. The third, of course, is increased resilience. So, of course, we've seen that, disruptions happen. We live in Pakistan. I think most of us are used to the kinds of disruptions that happen. We've seen protests, maybe, quite more frequently than a lot of other countries. So having a stronger regulatory management and business continuity planning in place can directly lead to increased resilience for your organization. And finally, corporate reputation. So one of the things that I found was really interesting in the last few years, SERB, or the Pakistan Business Council, they organize something called the IFC Gender Diversity Awards, and it's been seen that companies with the highest productivity and the most welcoming culture, so the youngest employees tend to go to the companies which have a strong corporate reputation. So companies that care about their employees, that have a good diverse workplace balance, and of course, the stronger stakeholder trust as well. So the traditional model is eventually giving way to the new business model where, employees are first and foremost in your corporate strategy, and they're given a lot of uh, attention and importance as well. So first and foremost, your social factors can really impact the organization's ability to attract and retain talent. We've talked about this earlier, but labor strikes or consumer protests can create a scarcity of skilled employees, as well as give rise to a controversy that tarnishes corporate reputation. And there are several examples from Pakistan as well. But the utility companies in the last few years, every time there's been an outage or a massive change in company culture or structure, several employees tend to leave. Either they join, sister organizations, or they tend to relocate abroad for better opportunities if they feel like they're not being compensated enough. So these could be, some of the factors that would directly impact employee retention. This is just one example that I wanted to highlight, and this has been done by several international organizations as well, like PayPal. But in Pakistan, Unilever has been really working on this. They've marketed this concept of a living wage or income by 2030. So, in the last couple of years, especially in Pakistan, we've seen that inflation has increased to almost 30%, 30 to 40%, even more for some sectors. So, at the bare minimum, Unilever has been trying to promote the concept that every employee, regardless of what level they are at, deserves to earn at least a living wage. And by living wage, it's not just minimum wage, which I think by law in Sindh is around 20 to 25,000 rupees per month. A living wage is annual income required for a household to afford a decent standard of living for all members of that household. So, of course, a living income in Pakistan would probably be very different from a living income in, let's say, Brazil or somewhere in the European Union. But it needs to be able to cover all of your costs, as well as, plan for emergencies, could be health emergencies, family emergencies, and be able to provide a decent quality of life for your children, for your parents, for your household typically. So in Pakistan, to achieve this goal, what Unilever has done is reduced the cost of healthcare benefits by providing health insurance to all of their employees, including sort of people who are not maybe in the head office. This encapsulate their entire kind of value chain. And they've increased minimum pay to around PKR 52,000 rupees per month for almost 60% of their workforce. I think these are generally full-time employees, but the plan is that by 2030, at least 100% of their employees should be earning a living income. And what they've seen is that these measures have resulted in increased employee retention as well as higher employee engagement scores. So in Pakistan, this is quite recent, but since they've been doing this globally for the last, I think, 3 to 5 years, they've already seen results in terms of increased employee retention as well as higher engagement. The second kind of customer segment or consumer segment that you might want to be concerned about is the safety risk of your own products, as well as political concerns which can affect a company's supply chain. So typically, corporations that limit safety risks from their products and services or minimize exposure to geopolitical conflicts tend to face less volatility in their businesses. And so there are several examples from Pakistan as well. We've seen recently in the pharmaceutical industry that there were some articles about certain cough syrups being hazardous or toxic for children, resulting in deaths. So there was a lot of backlash against the industry, and for a time at least, the business tends to die down. There's a direct impact. People start, not buying that particular product or switching to alternatives. So this is something that is directly related to a product safety risk, especially for an industry like pharmaceuticals. This might be very, very important. And then what we're seeing recently is the boycott movement, right? So this is another example. IKEA, and this is back in the day, they recalled their chests and dresses because of a serious tip over hazard. So unfortunately, because these IKEA dresses were not anchored to the walls, so children, would lean on them and the dresser would fall, and it resulted in several accidents. And IKEA was forced to recall all of these products and put out a warning to all of its customers and clients to return these products, and they gave free refunds. What we're seeing right now is the boycott movement, and this was historically very successful in South Africa, during the US civil rights movement, and during the Indian anti-colonial struggle as well, when Gandhi actually promoted kind of using locally made products versus kind of imported products. So this sort of movement is what we're seeing in Pakistan as well right now because of the war. So certain companies are being boycotted because their customers no longer agree with their source of funding or where their profits are going to essentially. Thirdly, of course, shifting social dynamics, and these have the potential to influence customer tastes. In different geographies, this might look very, very different, but what we're seeing right now is social media has a very strong influence on public opinion. It could result in physical strikes and company boycotts, as well as affect long-term shifts in customer preferences. So, in the last 10 years, especially in Western markets, there's been a huge move towards vegetarianism and veganism. So, there's a huge opportunity here as well to look for new customer segments that you can cater to. There are new products being marketed like green steel or anything that's environmentally more efficient or which has a lower carbon footprint. Especially in developed markets, the new customers are definitely preferring those versus traditional offerings. One example here is Nestle. Nestle has been steadily, reducing the salt, sugar, and fat content in its product portfolio for almost 10 years. And what they've seen is that these healthier foods grew at faster rates and also had higher profit margins. So these can be marketed as either green or healthy or extra nutritious. And the customers, of course, ask for these products. So you need to cater to these new markets, emerging markets. And then because of the new generation not wanting to use products made through child labor, so this has actually been very successful in Pakistan as well. In 2006, Nike actually ended its contract with one of the local companies in Faisalabad when it was seen that the company was employing children in their supply chain. And the company, unfortunately, fortunately, eventually went bankrupt. But this served as a warning to the competitor companies that, this is human rights abuses like these. Using children in your workforce or value chains is actually, it's a very critical aspect of doing business with them, especially, and it can be then used to mitigate such social risks. For those of us who were there at that time, the Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh kind of encapsulates all of these different sorts of risks that we've seen, in the last few slides. This was around 2000, I think 12, and this factory was supplying garments to all of the big brands in the European Union and the US, like Gap and Levi's and all of these big brands. So essentially, when this factory collapsed because of poor structural regulations and design, and no exit sources for their employees, so it uh, gave rise to a lot of social media backlash and also, traditional media backlash at that time. And the risks for the company included legal costs, of course, trying to work with lawyers to compensate the victims, to manage their contracts, worker unrest. So the entire Bangladesh garment factory suffered as a result because of this particular company's reputation. It impacted access to capital because now all of these firms needed to comply with additional ESG criteria to be able to get capital from international firms. It led to a decrease in sales and, of course, lost inventory and interrupted production because these were not maybe kept at a safe place, so directly impacted. And ultimately, what they faced was regulatory and public pressure to strengthen their sourcing policies. So, as a result of this disaster, all of their international clients essentially put in all of these terms and conditions into their sourcing policies to ensure that their suppliers in developed countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh and others were now required to comply with a lot of these new requirements from their suppliers. And Pakistan faces similar conditions. So the textile sector, especially because it's export oriented, has to comply with a lot of these ESG requirements of their customers and clients in other countries. So human rights due diligence, essentially, it is very, very important that a company complies with the international regulations and especially for exporting countries. This is from the OHCHR, and this is a global framework that can be used for human rights due diligence. First step, of course, is to assess impacts, and this can be done either through interviews with your stakeholders, directly talking to them, having them fill out surveys, and also just physically going and doing an audit. So that might be one way to assess impacts, to gauge the nature and extent of the human rights risk. And this particularly applies to supply chains, global supply chains like the electronics industry or the mining industry. It could be textiles as well, of course, but it depends really on the industry that you belong to. Second is, of course, to integrate and take action. And this can be done through integration with internal functions and processes. Most companies do have um, an ESG policy in place, at least in Pakistan now, and this can be made part of that. And again, you need to engage with different stakeholders, including your organizations, your employees, your customers and clients, the communities where you operate, just to ensure that such abuses are not occurring within your supply chain. Tracking the effectiveness of mitigation responses over time, and here you might get third-party auditors to come and do an audit to ensure that appropriate responses are being undertaken. And finally, communicating performance with respect to addressing these human rights. So let's say there was a massive incident in 2020, but after that, the company has really upgraded and revised its guidelines. So they would be able to then communicate these successes in their sustainability reports or on their websites. There are different medias, that you can use for communicating progress on human rights due diligence. So the third section essentially focuses on stakeholder engagement. Strong stakeholder engagement, again, is really, really important because it enables the companies to mitigate risks. So to identify as well as mitigate. The first step for conducting a stakeholder engagement for any business is to really identify who your stakeholders are. And the way I encourage companies to do this is to really map your value chain, depending on the product or service industry that you're from. Think about, where you get your raw materials from. How do you produce those raw materials? What kind of manufacturing processes are involved? There could be multiple suppliers of the raw materials as well. Then the production processes themselves, who do you impact directly? Who do you employ? And then how does the product get transported to either the retailers or third parties? And ultimately, who's the consumer? Who is buying or purchasing your product? So this will really help you identify who are the key stakeholders within your value chain. If you understand your business model really well, this should be relatively straightforward to do. Once you have kind of a stakeholder map, you see how they connect with each other, right? So if you're talking about key players in the government and the relevant sectors, so it's really important that you make connections among your different stakeholders. Who is related to who talks to which other stakeholder. Second step is to analyze political influence, interconnections, as well as the company perceptions of your stakeholders. And let's say, your company CEO or, the senior leadership has some kind of influence with your regulators or your government stakeholders. So then you would, use those connections to have dialogues, both one-on-one as well as, at national or international platforms. You might want to monitor your social media to see what your company's perception is like. And of course, your marketing teams might already be doing this to some extent. There are now like a lot of new tools and technologies to analyze what the reaction is to, let's say, a new product or a new offering, or even just look at risks. X might impact Y, that sort of analysis. The next step is to map or visualize the interplay of issues and relationships among the stakeholders. So let's say you're talking about climate change as an issue. So you might see, who are the people being impacted, who is responsible for, measuring sustainability and progress within your organization, who needs to be communicated about these issues, and how would you actually measure progress year on year? So of course you have your baseline, but then you also need to communicate that on an annual basis. And finally, because every organization has limited resources and time, you need to prioritize who to engage with and how. And this is, of course, done at the management level or the senior management level, because we can't talk to everyone and anyone. So we need to really prioritize how we spend our time and resources and who matters the most. So similar to a materiality assessment that you would conduct for, broader ESG issues, for the stakeholder map, you might assign ranks, so this is like stakeholder category number one, this is stakeholder category number two, etc. But typically for any value chain, what you look at is, for the employees, you want to foster diversity and inclusion, deliver value to your customers, deal fairly with suppliers. And this is important because especially in terms of supply disruptions, if you have a good relationship with your suppliers, then generally they will remain loyal to you. And they will, work with you during these times of disruption to minimize shortages or things that would impact your product. Then, of course, supporting local communities, ensuring that their voices are heard, that they're also benefiting from your organization. And this could be, of course, investments in health, education, and infrastructure, etc., but also providing employment to the local communities. That could be a way that a company would engage with them. With the regulators, of course, you need to comply with the green policies introduced by the regulators. The shareholders care about the long-term value, but increasingly what we're seeing is that the ISSB framework, the International Sustainability Standards Board, they really care about the value for the shareholders. And here what you need to talk about is the financial impact of environmental and social risks. So this should be communicated to your shareholders. And finally, the investors will also assess non-financial risks while they are making investment decisions within your company. So as I mentioned, the first step is to understand who your stakeholders are. And yes, one very important stakeholder is your banks or financial institutions because they provide a lot of capital for your company and to grow. So if you don't understand the expectations of your stakeholders, you can't really set the measurable targets to enhance performance. So really the first step in any materiality assessment, or when you're just at the beginning of your ESG journey, is to understand or map who your stakeholders are. And this can, of course, look different for different industries. The second step includes involving the stakeholders in building and updating the ESG strategy. Often what we've seen is companies tend to do this in isolation. It might be like a sustainability committee within an organization that's working on the ESG strategy, but the strategy needs to be informed by dialogue with your stakeholders, So after you've mapped out who they are, who your stakeholders are on the previous slide, you then need to engage with them, to talk to them, what matters most, what do they think are the key risks to the company in terms of ESG, and then have these dialogues with your employees, with your customers, investors, suppliers, regulators, and of course the general public as well. What kind of products would they like? How can the company improve its product offerings or services? And it's important that different stakeholder engagement strategies are used for different stakeholder groups. So let's say you're talking to your community where you operate, so they might not have, let's say, a very good hold on emails or websites or social media. So it's important to maybe set up one-on-one dialogues with them, either through some sort of community group or through people who are already actively engaged with them. So that might be a way to get their opinions or their insights on your product or your business strategy. For the shareholders, generally there's an annual meeting, and some companies also have quarterly meetings where they update their shareholders on the company's progress. And they might even send communications, either letters or emails, to update their shareholders on how the company is doing, or if there's a disruption or some key risks that they foresee in the future. This might be communicated directly to the shareholders by the organization. Then you might at the industry level talk to your other competitors, other companies within the same industry at forums or conferences. Let's say all the companies are facing a similar issue. So there might be an industry body that you can, discuss either problems or solutions at those platforms. We have the OICCI in Pakistan, the Pakistan Business Council, and then there are industry-specific forums as well, like the Pakistan Textile Council and others, where you can actually, as an industry, share your views and also, of course, involve the government or, politicians to think about what sorts of policies they are, coming up with. Then, of course, one-on-one meetings with policy influencers, surveys and questionnaires, and this might just be open access surveys where anyone can, provide an opinion, or they might be targeted surveys and questions if you have a specific query or an outcome that you are interested in, could be tailored to your audience. Then most companies, at least at the corporate sector level, have employee resource groups and diversity action committees. So let's say some employees are having issues, or they want to raise some complaints, they can come to these committees and make that complaint with the trust that that this will remain anonymous. And then broadly, if you want to communicate to your larger audience, websites, podcasts, and social media might be a good, stakeholder engagement strategy, because this gives an overall overview of what the company is doing, and how it's creating value for the organization. And then company newsletters and emails, they go out generally to the public. So the third step is really to develop an approach specific to each stakeholder group. So once you've mapped your stakeholders and developed a specific stakeholder engagement strategy, for specific insights, it's really important to follow up with them, to thank the stakeholders and provide feedback or next steps. Oftentimes what happens is, you'll spend 15, 20 minutes filling out a survey, but then you don't hear back for the next, 6 months. And, both the people who've responded to the survey, as well as anyone else who's actually been engaged with the company, they feel a little bit, used maybe. So it's important to communicate the win-wins, to invite stakeholders to activation workshops, and to identify concrete solutions to the issues that were identified. So the follow-up is really very, very important. You can't just have one dialogue and then tick the box. It's really important to remain engaged with your stakeholders and tell them, how their suggestions have been looked at, and how the company has changed its approach to respond to their concerns. Second, of course, is taking action, and this can be done at the individual level, of course, but if you do it as part of an industry coalition or industry partners, the impact will be significantly larger. So one of the issues that the industry has done, the FMCG industry, is the Core Alliance, and this is for minimizing plastic waste. And all of these different companies have signed up for this, including packagers and Nestle, I think Unilever as well, several other companies, which are responsible for a lot of the plastic waste that we generate. And they've been working with their suppliers as well as customers to understand, where are the knowledge gaps, how can we reduce plastic, how can we meet our commitment to reducing waste. So this is how you can take action at the industry level. And lastly, it's about making it happen. So it's important to set quantify targets, and there are various platforms to do this. For greenhouse gas emissions, we have the Science-Based Targets Initiative, but you can have other targets as well, and then link them to incentives where appropriate. So you might offer incentives to, let's say, your senior management or your executive leadership, that your bonus might be tied to a certain ESG metrics, or you might set a target for yourself that 30% of my labor force will be female by 2025, and then you will take steps to encourage more female employees at different levels within your organization, support them throughout their career, and monitor performance where needed. So these are essentially the three steps that you need. So following up, taking action, and finally executing, your commitments. Typically, ESG key performance indicators are trackable metrics which you can use to measure progress. So on the social side, we talked about environment last time, so I won't go into that. But on the social side, some of the KPIs you could track are employee diversity. And like I said, gender is just one of the KPIs. You could track employee diversity in terms of ethnicity, in terms of minority religion, in terms of ability. There are other metrics as well. Employee training, and by training, it's not just that they've attended certain numbers of trainings. It's about like before and after. So generally, you would have some sort of a feedback form, or maybe a knowledge building platform where over a period of time your employees are upskilled in a certain task or a certain new technology that they're required to now use. Consumer responsiveness, and this typically measures how quick are firms to respond to complaints. I think K-Electric has done a reasonably good job in the last 5 years. Previously, they would be quite slow to respond, but they've really become active on social media, and they're engaging with their customers through multiple platforms, including WhatsApp, including their websites, and through telephones. They've reduced their paper consumption. So, I mean, they're trying to be more responsive to customer complaints. Then you might track employee health and safety. So typically this used to be a separate department on its own, HSE, Health, Safety and Environment, but this broadly falls under the social pillar of ESG. So here you might track, the typical accident rate, number of fatalities in a certain industry, number of near misses. So this is like, something that could have gone badly wrong, but didn't. So I think the fertilizer and the chemical industries typically track these. The power sector typically tracks employee health and safety as well. Pay equality, and by this I mean at the same level, somebody who is, has a similar qualification or educational background, similar years of experience. So ideally, they should be paid around the same. There should be no discrimination based on gender or any other metric. And finally, the rate of employment. So how, like things like employee turnover, if a certain department is facing high employee turnover, this typically signals that something is not right within the department. And then you might want to investigate, why are so many people leaving and moving? Where are they moving? Why are they moving? So it's typically the human resource function within your organization will have some good insights around this. One example here is Salesforce. It's a global organization, and they use a simple scorecard method, to address the gender gap and to improve the organizational reputation. So they give their team leaders a scorecard to track how often they promote and hire women and underrepresented minorities. What they saw was, this was a modest increase, but in 2 years, the proportion of females increased from 30% to almost to 32% over a period of 2 years. And they hired almost 4,000 women in 2018 alone. And we're seeing a lot of this sort of action by local companies as well. Jazz, several of these companies have taken active measures to increase the proportion of females in their workforce. This scorecard actively allows your managers to address diversity. So there's a very popular saying, you can't manage what you can't measure. So it's important that you're using some kind of a metric to, quantitatively measure progress, from the previous year. And if there's no progress, then you need to communicate that, the reasons for that. Why did you, or why was your organization not able to meet certain targets? And finally, pay audits. These ensure that no man makes more than a woman for equal work. So in 2017, the difference was around $3 million for this particular company. And since then, they've taken, active measures to reduce this pay gap and move towards more equal pay. This is just an example from Interloop. It's one of the large textile companies of Pakistan. And then on the social side, some of their targets include increasing workforce diversity to around 30% women by 2025, boosting employee engagement to 70%, and training around 80% of the workforce on relevant and future competencies. So these are broad targets, again, not very specific, but typically this is how you would communicate your targets as part of your sustainability report. It's just an example. Okay. So coming to the regulatory side, the Constitution of Pakistan already contains a lot of provisions with regard to labor, right? And there have been several policies since then, but just at the very fundamental level, Article 11 of the Constitution, it prohibits all forms of slavery, forced labor, and child labor. Article 17 already includes a fundamental right to exercise freedom of association. There has been a bit of back and forth on this. Article 25 talks about the right to equality before law, as well as the prohibition of discrimination on the grounds of gender alone, right? So this is already laid down in our constitution. And finally, the Article 37E talks about providing just and humane conditions for work, ensuring that children and women are not employed in vocations unsuited to their age, and for maternity benefits for women in employment. So all of these are already enshrined in the Constitution of Pakistan. And since then, of course, there have been several changes to some of these laws as well. But for the most part, everything that we've talked about so far has been approved in the Constitution of the country. More recently, as I mentioned earlier, the SECP, Securities and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, has provided certain ESG performance metrics, and these have been identified by the World Federation of Exchanges in terms of stock exchanges. And here what we've included are just some of the categories that they are encouraging companies to report on going forward. So for most of you who might be aware, the International Sustainability Standards Board standards, the ISSB framework was formally, the two standards, S1 and S2, were launched in June 2023, so very recently. And starting next year, globally, all of the listed companies, especially in the EU and other Western economies, they'll be required to report according to the ISSB framework. So I think the SECB felt that it was probably very, very comprehensive. So just to get companies started and to get them thinking about this, they've picked certain indicators and are encouraging companies on a voluntary basis now to start reporting according to these metrics. So on the social side, one of the things they've highlighted in their draft guidelines, and as I said, these are open to anyone to respond to. So first is the CEO pay ratio, then the gender pay ratio, and this is to address the pay gap between genders. Employee turnover rate, so percentage year-on-year change for both full-time and part-time employees. Then gender diversity at different levels within the organization, including at the boardroom, at entry and mid-level positions, and then at the senior and executive level as well. Then you have your temporary worker ratio, so how many full-time, how many part-time employees, and then you need to track non-discrimination. So for now, it's just a yes/no policy. Does your company have a sexual harassment policy or a non-discrimination policy in place? So companies just need to, answer yes or no. Do you have a confidential, so anonymous grievance redressal mechanism in place in case of such an incident? So again, it's yes/no. And then the percentage of women and men promoted during the year. So this also kind of tracks, are women being promoted at the same rates as men? Then on the kind of HSE side and employee well-being side, so things you might that you're required to now track include injury rates, so the frequency of injury events relative to your workforce time. Does your company have an occupational health and safety policy? This is still yes/no. Does your company follow a child labor policy, overall human rights policy, as well as marketing? So do you have responsible gender-sensitive marketing or communication, or is it embedded somewhere larger? And then I just wanted to briefly touch upon the State Bank's ESRM manual as well, because this is kind of cross-cutting, whoever is availing financing from any of the local banks in Pakistan, they need to be aware that the State Bank of Pakistan, in November of 2022, they released the Environmental and Social Risk Management Manual for banks. And the idea was to operationalize the Green Banking Guidelines of 2017. So some of the changes from the GBGs is that this now has a greater focus on social and climate risk. And by social, of course, the IFC performance standards apply for certain big projects, but also, you need to be in compliance with local laws. There's an ENS due diligence checklist, which your relationship manager or whoever is kind of lending to a new company will need to complete before they're allowed to lend to a new company or to a new project. Then there's a focus on applicability based on sector-specific ENS impacts. And I encourage you to go through the manual. It's available online. So there's a whole section on, what are the sector-specific risks within an industry. And then they've defined clear organizational roles for risk assessment and decision making. So, if it's a low risk business, then typically the financing can be done quite quickly. But if it's a high risk or a sensitive area, then it needs to be increased or highlighted to senior management. So I'll end right there. Essentially, Edelman's 2022 Trust Barometer, it showed that 88% of institutional investors, look at non-financial information when they're making investment decisions within any company. So as best practices, what companies need to do is to share progress proactively. So don't wait for somebody to come and ask you about your, ESG business practices. You need to be able to demonstrate that you're already following all of the local and international guidelines, and also reporting all of this information openly and transparently to your stakeholders. What this does, it helps build your credibility, and it will increase trust with the public sector. Second, of course, is embracing end-to-end transparency. So where I talked about mapping out your value chain, that's like really the first step. So you need to be aware of the origin of your products. It's fine maybe if your corporate sector, if your head office is very, very compliant, but if the human rights abuses are happening elsewhere in your supply chain, um, it will eventually be, highlighted in the media, and you might face some sort of social risk from that sort of leakage. You need to align your internal practices with your external communications. So addressing issues like pay equity and talent diversity, it can help create legitimacy in your external communications. So whatever you are reporting should be what's being followed locally or internally as well. A report on metrics. So I think the yes no is only applies to certain categories, but if you're able to show progress, based on certain metrics, measurable quantitative metrics, then you can really communicate your ESG impact in a way that's able to measure progress from one year to the next. And finally, it's a best practice that all of your ESG information needs to be in one place, ideally in a sustainability report or somewhere on your website where any investor or any stakeholder can access that information. So these are just some of the best practices that we encourage organizations to follow. Yeah, so I'll end right there. I think we do have a few questions. Okay.
Thank you, Maha, for such a detailed and very insightful presentation, I would say. And I'm sure that all of our participants have learned something and have special takeaways on ESG, especially the social dimension that you covered today. There are a few questions here. I would say comments and not as many questions. In fact, uh, very knowledgeable presentation. Quality management is talked about, but human management plays a very vital role in improving the quality output, which goes without saying. Thanks, as my question is answered in subsequent slides. Well done, Maha, and God bless you. Great. So I think
Just
we've managed to explain in detail, and we don't have any questions for this. Having said that, I would also suggest that we will be putting up this slide and this entire webinar on the PSX YouTube channel. So if you want to at any point go and revisit it and check it out and learn from it, it will be available. I would also request Ms. Maha to add her credentials in the last slide. So in case anybody wants, they can reach out to you directly. They want to take your advice, they want to engage with you for any consultation, they should be able to do that. So you will, all the listeners, attendees will see and find information readily available there. So thank you very much once again. And inshallah, we'll be coming back to you with the last of this series webinars. And the date will be confirmed shortly. It will also be posted on our social media pages. So please keep visiting and make sure that you do not miss that. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maha, once again. Allah Hafiz.